Um, Today, we're going to be hearing from Margaret Clarke. Margaret serves as the Assistant Professor of Marriage and Family Therapy and the head of the Counseling Department at Briercrest College and Seminary in Caronport, Saskatchewan, Canada. Prior to joining the faculty at Briercrest, Dr. Clarke worked in frontline medical healthcare. So to get things started, welcome, Margaret, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and have this opportunity to share today. So I'm going to be sharing with you some findings from my research regarding clergy resilience. And so I'm going to start us off by just giving you a quick overview of the study that I did. And my interest, again, my background, again, I'm a therapist, I'm a professor, I also happen to be a pastor's wife. And so I was quite interested in this process of understanding how is it that clergy pastors bounce back from the challenges that they face. And so did a study of this as part of my doctoral research. So what I'm going to present to you today is part of a bigger study. I did a mixed method study, looked at a number of questions with some other findings, but I'm going to focus today on this question that I was curious about, and it was really looking at what are the variables and that's both on an individual, a social, relational, or a contextual and organizational level that clergy perceive to impact their professional resilience. And I was really curious to understand this. So I had the chance to do, I did a survey, Canadian survey online, and also did some one-on-one semi-structured interviews, and then did an interpretation panel, which I invited experts in the field of clergy training and educators and clergy care to speak into the findings. And so I'm going to share what the findings were in the categories that came. So first, I think there's many ways, if you're, resilience is kind of a buzzword. It's also a little bit hard to measure. And so one of the things that there are different approaches to understanding resilience. And so my understanding of resilience is really what I refer to as a process view. And so the definition that I use for my study is that resilience is a process that arises from a combination of individual, relational, and contextual variables that results in positive adaptation to adversity. And so again, this idea, it isn't just something that people are or are not resilient. It's something that happens based in context of what we have access to. And so these ideas of looking into that and understanding that more. So that was kind of a framing perception of how I went into my study and when I talked to my participants, how I approached it with them. So one of the things, this is a model, and I'm just going to share this briefly. We'll touch on it again at the end. But one of the things I went into this, again, understanding and thinking about resilience as a process, something that is contextual, that isn't something that's just within individuals, but that's something that arises in response and is affected by what's going on relationally and organizationally and all those things. And so one of the things I want to just point out in this model, so I developed a generic model first based on a number of resilience models out there, but wasn't specific to clergy. And then what I did is at the end, I took my findings and made it to reflect this, and hopefully in a way that's just really useful. I guess it's part of research, but more so the therapist and the pastor's wife of me hopes that it's just really useful to clergy. And one of the things that I want to just invite you to think about is this sort of balancing aspect. And that it is something that ebbs and flows in our life. So we're going to be focusing, of course, on the supportive resources part in understanding and thinking about that today. But of course, resilience comes in response to challenges or adversity. And often the informal way we talk about resilience is the ability to bounce back. And an image I like to think about is, those stress balls. We squish them and then they pop back. Maybe they're the little yellow smiley face squish balls, right? But they go from being round and we squish them and then they bounce back and they return to the round state. And so this image kind of shows that pressure, the adversity and the challenges that come. And again, my study did look at categories there. I'm not going to talk about that today, but then this idea of what are the things that cause the bounce back? Cause us to return to that original kind of stress ball shape of how do they do. And so that's where this this image of how these things interact with one another and are in balance with one another. And so the question, again, that was able to talk with folks about was this: what are the variables that they perceive to help support them in the resilience? Again, I looked specifically at resilience. There's a lot of overlap when we think about well-being in general, flourishing, some amazing work. I didn't actually look at all that. I looked specifically at what was out there around clergy resilience. There's not a lot. So I actually looked at parallel fields of teachers and nursing and looked at kind of what they know about resilience. And so, but it's been interesting after the fact, of course, so much overlap when we think about well-being in general and flourishing for clergy. And so these categories became refined, where I just originally had sort of the broad categories in my definition, really began to look at what are the themes of categories, and use thematic analysis with my findings to really put into the themes of spiritual resources. Not a big surprise there when we're talking about clergy. The importance of relational resources, the importance of personal kind of practices and personal aspects within oneself, and then of course organizational resources that support clergy resilience. And so I'm going to unpack those a little bit for you, but we're going to give you guys a chance to get back into your breakoff groups. And I want you all to think and have a discussion of what helps you bounce back from the adversity and challenges that you encounter. So I hope you guys had some rich discussions, and in the same way of my opportunity to talk to a lot of different pastors and find out what supports their resilience, all the ideas and resources that you access, and so much, I think, whether you're a clergy person yourself or whether you're a support to them, there's so much that I think is common among it, and then perhaps a few unique things that are especially needed given the life of clergy and what they face. So I'm going to jump in and share with you my findings. So this again was an exploratory study, which means that I recorded anything and everything that my folks shared with me that they identified as a resource that helped their resilience. So it doesn't distinguish what's the most effective, or I didn't do analysis on what are the top ones, anything like that. It was just I tried to capture it all, and certainly some things were mentioned more than others, but opportunity for further research to understand that more. But I think as we dig into this, there will be so much that just resonates and makes sense. So talking about spiritual resources, again, this I don't think is a surprise to anyone. If you noticed in my model, I didn't stem there too much. There is an overarching impact on some of these that really seem to play a role in that sort of global meaning level. And certainly here, the purpose and calling for clergy was a very central piece to what they identified to their resilience. The whole process of what I've called theological meaning making. And this is really, how do they make sense? How do they make sense and understand both what is the challenge that they're facing? How might they understand challenges in their life and ministry? And then also how do they understand resources and supports? So that was a central piece of something that supported resilience. Of course, relationship with God, and expressed in different ways depending on the tradition of the clergy person. Communal faith. I did collect my data at the beginning of the pandemic. It was between June and August of 2020. And so I think this aspect maybe came through even more because this is when everything was shut down where we live. And so that importance of communal relating with people, connecting with people is so important and mentioned. And then of course, I've just called them spiritual practice, but pretty much in any and every type of spiritual practice was mentioned as meaningful in clergy persons' lives as far as resources that support. And so the category of spiritual, I think for lots of people, they're not surprised by this, and lots of clergy prioritize this in their own life. Relational, and again, lots of the other research which recognizes how important relationships are, and this again, just such a expansive amount of relationships that different clergy identified as supportive. So no one person had all of these resources in their life. Again, I just collected them all, but this was just so many different types. So spouse, was a central one and was mentioned a lot, and was a central part of that in as a support for the clergy person. Likewise, family. So again, I spoke with some clergy who weren't married, but family, and this could be like extended family, adult children, basically family who really understood, especially got ministry, were a big support in clergy resilience, and somebody that they really saw as a support in their resilience. Friends. Friends came with lots of interesting discussion. So there was the sense of friends who have nothing to do with, they're not part of the church. They've maybe been long-term friends. They just know me for who they are. I think of a priest who told me a story of a friend who'd known him since he was little and just told it to him straight. She didn't think of him as priest so-and-so. She just had a relationship and loved him and supported him in such an interesting way. So there's those type of long-term friends, friends who maybe are just play friends, so to speak. They're just friends that you have fun with. There's friends who understood ministry and supported that well. There was friends within the congregations. Lots of interesting discussion around boundaries around that and sort of the complication, but there certainly were a wide variety of friendships within congregations that clergy saw as supportive, with the consideration of sort of that dual role, and that friend might not be able to share in certain aspects of the person's life. Peers. This was a really big part that lots and lots of people talked about as supportive of the resilience. And this was just the ability to connect with people who got it. You didn't have to kind of give all the background, they just got it. And it was like the sharing of ideas, it was friendship, it was blurred the line, friendship, peers, but there was something about other folks in ministry and having that relationship that was very supportive for their resilience. Mentors. So again, people in the field, but just that bit further along, and especially early in ministry. This was something that lots of people, different people, had processes in their sort of accreditation or ordination process where that was intentional and set up, but endured, but was really key in what they would say was a support to their resilience. Supervisor support. This looked different, right? Depending on what that meant. So again, some people had a supervising pastor in their context. Some it was more of a bishop or somebody in a denominational role. Some it was a key sort of lay leader in their setting, but having a supportive relationship of a supervisor who could support and care and be concerned with the well-being was something that was really meaningful. While we unfortunately hear stories where congregants aren't always supportive of clergy, for those who had it, where they felt loved and supported, the folks I talked to who had that, they would say, this supports my resilience, when they had that support from congregants. And professional supports. This was an interesting category. So this came out in accessing professional therapists, psychologists. It might be a spiritual director, it might be a life coach. And this was a very interesting dimension of that space that was there for them. It was protected. The confidentiality aspect was very key. It was maybe something that they didn't need all the time. Some things, spiritual directors are often engaged on a really regular basis. Sometimes it was more almost like preventative, like I've got this connection with my therapist and I don't see them all the time, but I know when things go bad, they're there as a resource to me. And so those kind of professional supports were also key parts that were mentioned by quite a number of the respondents in this. Personal. And again, this is a lot of the pieces of just personal practices that are important, and especially given the nature of clergy work and the challenges that come with that. And so this idea of balance, I didn't put work-life balance, but it's that kind of idea of, how do I not just be all work, all ministry all the time? How do I have space for things beyond that? All kinds of practices about caring for health. Heard so many different stories, whether it was diet or exercise or sleep, just how essential that was and that they saw as essential for their resilience. Boundaries kind of goes with balance, yet a little bit nuanced. And this was really the ability to have boundaries around what is what is me and what is work and what is ministry. Some of those were literally physical boundaries. I spoke to ministers serving in remote locations where the church and the parsonage were attached, and people would just walk in, and just literally like a boundary, like a door, and being clear on when that was accessible and when that wasn't. Of course, boundaries, saying no to some of the work that comes or the expectations that come. And so that was a key thing for quite a number of folks. This idea of self-awareness, but just this idea of the own awareness of what's going on internally, or own emotions, how those come out and are impacted, was another piece that a lot of people identified as part of the resilience. Lifelong learning. I loved one Anglican Archbishop, I think, and they talked about just like learn always. It doesn't matter what it is, just learn, and how life-giving and supportive of their resilience that they saw that, and came out time and time again. Clergy love to learn, and learning was just really supportive of that in just a broad sense. I'm going to talk specifics in a second, but just broadly, lifelong learning. Institutional alignment was another thing. That alignment between either the congregation's kind of direction and the clergy persons, or the denominational direction and the clergy persons, was really interesting. And a lot of people actually shared stories of moving and transitioning between, say, denominations, because they found without that alignment, their resilience was just really suffering and they weren't able to bounce back. And then, of course, personal attributes. Again, I mentioned there's different ways of conceiving resilience, and certainly some are sort of personality traits. And people definitely saw that certain things like optimism, flexibility, things such as that definitely helped their resilience, and would say, yeah, I'm really optimistic, or I'm really flexible when it comes to things, and that helps me to be resilient. So there definitely was an element of that as well. And so various practices or qualities just that were identified as enhancing resilience. And then organizationally. So one of the things I really am cautious about as I approach resilience, we know from some other fields, especially nursing, the critique has been in nursing that sometimes when a profession approaches resilience as just an individual responsibility, it becomes then, oh, we're just going to expect our workers to be more resilient, rather than addressing some of the challenges in the field, the adversity that is actually unnecessary and needs to be addressed on a systemic level. And so I think it's important to remember that, and as I have no doubt that our group does, that resilience isn't just something that's individual. It's not an individual responsibility. It's a systemic, and it's an organizational responsibility. And the clergy I had a chance to connect with definitely identified these aspects of organizational resources that fed their resilience. Things such as adequate provision. And this was, again, it could be salary, it could be some had housing provided, but just adequate provision so that their needs are met. Role flexibility. In general, I mean, and we know this from other research, but clergy get to do lots of things, which is a challenge, but in general, they kind of love that. People who do well as clergy tend to love the ability to be very flexible in what they're doing and have a lot of say in how they minister. And so that was something that was definitely identified as important. A rigorous discernment and preparation process. This one, again, I come from a tradition where it's an evangelical tradition where there's not like a hierarchy of sort of affirming calling. Generally, people kind of feel that individually, go away to school, and then after the fact, go through their affirmation process. I was really interested to talk to traditions such as Catholic and Anglican, and those who have much more of a front-end loaded discernment process and affirmation process. And they time and time again told me how in times that were challenging, how much they came back to that rigorous process, even though at the time they didn't always appreciate it. They came back and said, no, I know this is my calling. I've been affirmed and had all of this process that's affirmed my calling. And it was like this foundation that really fueled them in tough times and helped that bounce back. And so for those who had, again, other traditions, it looks a little different, but they would often come back to this sort of central aspect of calling and affirmation of their calling in that. Again, we know from other places, but my participants and findings also supported early ministry supports. We know that those who are early in ministry have unique needs. And again, lots of folks talked about how important for their resilience it was to have those early ministry supports, things like mentors, things like various things set up that help them access that. In the Catholic tradition, they are required to connect with a spiritual director as part of their training. And it was interesting how much, folks who were well along in their career came back and said, that was really important to me to realize I needed that to help me be resilient. And so those kind of things built in early to support, the relational dynamics. There's lots of cohort things that different people had put in place, different organizations, but those early ministry supports put in place by the organization are really key. Skill-specific training. Again, ministry workload is diverse and beyond anyone's own capacity. And so they just appreciated organizations like, I don't know how to run a organization of a $2 million budget. So I like having an organizational resource of somebody who helps me with that at the denomination. Or I don't know how to handle, I have to fire the janitor. I don't know how to do that. I like having this resource. And it was a support and something that they could go to, or specific training on suddenly we all need to stream our services. I need supports. And so organizationally, supports and resources were really important. And then relational opportunities. And these were, because relationships are so important, when the organization provides those opportunities, provides those chances to gather at denominational events or interdenominational events, these were all resources that supported their resilience and were discussed. So a few things that come from my findings, but I want to invite you guys to go back into your groups and think about this. In your life, what helps you stay connected to the resources that support your own resilience and well-being? Again, it's one thing to say, oh yeah, these are a resource. Staying connected to them is part of the journey for of resilience as well. So I want to invite you back into your groups to talk about that. So a few thoughts as we kind of come in and think about this. So I guess for me, again, I hope with this research, along with others, at the end of the day, to help pastors and clergy to thrive and to help them to do well and to live into their calling. And so as we think about, okay, so we, hopefully it maybe not new, or maybe it just kind of provided a good kind of summary of the resources, this invitation as either we are, in ministry yourself, or you're walking alongside those in ministry. One of the things, and I hope as I work and walk alongside folks, is that I can invite them into this concept of recognizing that resilience ebbs and flows. It isn't something we arrive at. For a while, I talked about balance, like it's this thing we arrive at. And now I've moved to talk about balancing, because I think it's this, again, I know, sometimes when you try balance moves, you don't kind of land them and you're just there and you've got it. Usually it's like a constant shaking and rocking and having moments of balance. And so this model, I like this kind of concept in, first of all, just recognizing and inviting folks into recognizing the challenges that they are facing. Ministry work is beautiful and challenging. And so just in this invitation to reflect on and be aware of the adversity that they're facing, the challenges that they're facing, how it's impacting them. Tune into that. And that's an invitation I often make to folks I'm working with. And then also tune into this aspect of what are the resources that you have in your life. And one of the things that I use sometimes is I have this resource checklist, and it's basically just a summary in a little bit, hopefully more accessible language, of some of those resources that my participants shared with me. And what I do is I invite people to reflect on what do you have in your life right now, because that changes, right? If there's suddenly the death of a mentor or a loss of a close friend because they've moved away, or, in the middle of the pandemic, if swimming is one of a key resource for your resilience and you can't go swimming because everything's shut down, these are changing, right? And maybe adversity and challenges are increasing. And so this constant ebb and flow, and just to be able to step back and to tune in on that aspect. And so I have this list. Thad has maybe as a copy, maybe you can share in the chat or send out. And it's just a really practical tool of like, think about what do you have in your life? And so I invite them to think about what do they currently have. I invite them to think about what have you had in the past that maybe isn't there anymore, because that's often an opportunity of what we know works, right? I don't think everything works for all people. I think there's lots of diversity. We all have different things that, help us to be resilient and bounce back. But often we know from the past what's been helpful. And so thinking about past things that we've maybe lost connection to or lost access to can be helpful. And then I also invite them to look at that list and think about what's intriguing to you on that list. And maybe what do you want to mark as something to explore and experiment with? We do know, in this model that I developed, I tried to get that dynamic nature. One of the challenges we know for ministry work is that it kind of prevents connecting to resources. And so this invitation and this work we can do to help clergy really understand and prioritize their well-being and to think about this, that's one of my hopes, is that I can do that. I'm having the privilege where I teach at Briercrest Seminary to teach a brand new course that we're offering as an elective, approaches to clergy well-being. And this is a course where we're equipping therapists, which I train, but also our ministry students, to invite them into understanding, again, what is research telling us about the challenges for those in ministry, but also what we can do to support and help you to flourish, to be resilient, to thrive, to have great health. And so, as we bring together all of these things, again, this invitation for clergy to be aware and tuned in. And so I hope this has been helpful. Again, there's a number of resources I think Thad and the team might share after the fact, some articles I've written and things like that. And I'm always happy to connect too, but I think we have some time for Q&A, right?
Yeah, so we're going to be moving into Q&A time now. If you want to use the raise hand function or just type your question in chat and I can read it for you, or maybe I'll call on you to read it for us. So I've got a couple questions to get us started while you kind of think about your questions or write them down. So I guess my first question is, so you've mentioned this theological meaning making as being really significant and even having an overarching impact on the kind of resilience that the clergy have. In your research, did you find info on how the clergy came to that meaning making? Was that just like personal beliefs that they had developed, or were they ideas that were shared by a denomination with them, or a seminary taught them? Did they learn it from reading a book or something, or maybe a combination of those or something else? And how might we encourage or build meaning making that builds resilience?
Wow, what a great question. So I will just say what I'm going to say does not come from my research. This is sort of personal opinion and perspective. So I didn't have the chance to dig into that. It was almost an ethereal piece that was hard to capture, although other models of resilience do sort of recognize this, this meaning level. And so that's where that generic model came. I think as I spoke to people, it was this sort of unspoken part, because theological meaning is such a big piece for, I think, believers in general, right? But I think for clergy especially. And so it was everything from, again, what is it, how do they understand suffering, right? So we might think about a theology of suffering, and that could be a hugely beneficial piece to resilience. There also potentially are some challenges with that, right? Where it could be where people are putting up with things that maybe actually need to be addressed, right? We know interpersonal criticism within congregations is not a healthy thing for clergy. But is there a space where people just feel like, oh, well, this is my cross to bear. And so it's maybe not being addressed at a level that would be more helpful. Again, I think some of the pieces that we see where how do clergy, and I've had some interesting conversations with some colleagues on how do clergy feel permission to take care of themselves? This is something in the course I'm going to teach. I'm going to make my students wrestle with, because I think it's an important question of, I'm a therapist. I believe, it's resonant with our faith and our theology, but there's things that others might suggest that maybe, oh, it's selfish or whatever. And I think we have to wrestle with that. So I would say I would love to see other people dig into this piece, because it's very unexplored. It didn't get it, but it just kind of emerged. And I think it's important, and I would love to see further discussion on it.
Okay, well, thank you. So we've got a question in the chat here from Andrew Oswald. It says, as you think about your seminary class and new clergy, do you feel like there's a generational shift in terms of the way that young leaders value sustainable practice, where older leaders might value work ethic and sacrifice? Do you see kind of a shift there?
I think so. Again, that would be just my sort of opinion and perspective. I do think if we look at some of the generational things in general, and so I think of course, it's going to play out in our ministry folks. I do think there is a different concept of what does sustainable look like. One of the concepts when I talk with folks in ministry and talk about this idea is, and again, it's probably my way of kind of approaching it from a theological meaning level, is a lot of people kind of react to the concept of self-care. It's big in my field, right? Self-care. And there's elements of people don't necessarily like that because it feels a little bit selfish, maybe, right? And I've started to talk about this concept of self-stewardship. And I think this sense of if one of the biggest things we are given to steward in our life is ourself, how do we steward that well to the calling that we feel God has? And I think that piece has been something that has been an invitation for people to think about, where it does give meaning. The general kind of societal view of self-care isn't really grounded in a sense of calling or service to God. But I think when we can think about it, and maybe a way to think about that as stewardship, it can be. And I do see probably more promising things in our younger generation of just different priorities, different awareness of the importance of physical and mental health, for sure.
It looks like another question here from Jeremy Thomas is, do you think that clergy are willing to be cared for by lay leaders and helpers, only by other clergy or by professional therapists? So like, who do you think kind of clergy are willing to be cared for by?
Oh, wow, what a rich, again, another rich, complex question. So, and I'm going to generalize this a little bit. So caregiving professions in general. So again, I would fall into that as a therapist. We can think about nurses. I think all of those types of occupations can struggle with receiving care. And I do think definitely pastors can struggle with that, especially when your kind of go-to is to be in the caregiving role as opposed to the receiver role. And that is where I would say I'm part of a project, a really great project in Canada called the Canadian Thriving Multivocational Ministry Project. And we are having the opportunity through some funding to provide free therapy to multivocational leaders. And we've been learning through this process. We've been seeing it as really learning process. And up until now, I don't think I would have said to anybody, just my theoretical orientation as a therapist, that you should always everybody should have a therapist. Like everybody should have a family doctor. I don't take that perspective. I'm like, you got a problem, come see us. If you don't, you're great. You go on. I do wonder a little bit more proactively for clergy, because the ability to have safety, so the confidentiality that professional therapy provides, or again, it might be a spiritual director or a life coach, but something like that, where it has very clear ethical boundaries around confidentiality. So the safety factor is high, but where it is a one-way relationship. It is by design a one-way relationship. If you come see me as a therapist, you're not there to take care of me or for us to, it is ethically, I am there to care for you and to help you. And I think that there is something really powerful. It's been something that's been like percolating in my mind. I think because of the nature, I think it is helpful. Now, there are lots of other supportive relationships, so that's not only one, but I think in the same way, we kind of like I might be a bit more inclined to say to pastors like get to know a therapist before you need them, or some kind of professional helper before you need them, because when you are not doing well, it's really hard to put the energy into making that connection. Maybe you don't see them, maybe you have a once every 6 months or once a year checkup, kind of touch base, here's where I'm at in life when things are going well. But when things are not going well, then you have that developed relationship. It is there solely for you to receive care. And so I think that is one support. There are lots of others. And I think the safety factor is high. We know this from some other research. The trust and safety factor is very, very important for clergy and their spouses.
Thank you. So another question in the chat from Pauline is, in your research, have you come across anything that would indicate an inability to reach a healthy level of resiliency because someone's been too depleted for an extended period of time?
I didn't do anything specific to that in my research. Again, maybe in my journey and my, just wondering and thinking on this, I think there is a lot of dimensions we need to consider. And so even in that model, right, I came up with, I think it is important to recognize that we can't say that, I hesitate to say this, especially the theological meaning waking, right? I can do all of Christ things through Christ who strengthens me. I don't know if people are infinite when it comes to the adversity they can challenge. I also believe, in the strength that ministers have through their relationship with God. But I think there is that. We know that there are traumatic experiences that clergy experience and their families experience. There's research around that. And so that place of, there's a lot we don't know. So I think this piece I would always say to people is take care of yourself, because I think there sometimes are walls or benchmarks that the recovery journey is long and hard from. I'm not going to say impossible, but it is long and hard. If we look at burnout, if we look at trauma, these are all things that impact clergy, and there's a lot we don't know about where those lines are. And so, sorry, I got mixed up there a little bit. I don't know if I answered the question or not.
Yeah, I think you did a good job of answering. Kind of just, you talked about the maybe limits of resiliency, like if there is a limit, that kind of thing. So
yeah. There is one theory, I will say this, there is one theory out there, again, just a theory, but it talks about the curvilinear relationship between adversity and resilience, in that sense of if you have low resilience, low adversity, you can actually have low resilience. It's actually sort of a moderate level of adversity that brings high resilience, but then too much adversity and resilience is low again. And so I think there is this relationship that we don't totally understand. And I again would really encourage everyone to be just cautious in being tuned into that and aware of that. I don't think we're infinite in our ability to cope with that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, all of you here, and thank you, Dr. Clarke.